Avian Health and Wellness, presented by Frank Witowski, DVM. The mission of Companion Parrots Rehomed is to accept companion parrots from unwanted, emergency, or crisis situations throughout the greater North and South Carolina areas, and to facilitate through training and education new adoptive homes for these sensitive and highly intelligent creatures. Frank Witowski, DVM, from Animal Care Hospital of Matthews. Frank Witowski, DVM, graduated from North Carolina State University College of Veterinary Medicine in the spring of 1990. Upon graduation, he went to work for Butler Animal Hospital. In 1992, Dr. Witowski purchased Butler Animal Hospital and changed the name to Animal Care Hospital of Matthews. Dr. Witowski is currently, and has been in the past, the proud owner of many different pet species, including dogs, cats, birds, horses, tortoises, chameleons, and fish. Dr. Witowski has led many eco-tours to observe parrots in their natural environments.
These are the key takeaway points, things that we will go over today that are very important to know in caring for your bird. First of all, the importance of a healthy diet and exercise for your bird to keep them in optimal health. The next thing we'll go over are potential hazards in your homes. Toxins, inhaled pollutants and things like that in your environment. Other household hazards such as windows, ceiling fans, etc. We'll talk about keeping your bird's environment clean, and also talk about observational skills, reading body language, looking for signs of illness in your birds, that kind of thing, to help keep on top of their health, and if they should get sick, to identify that early. Very important to learn how to look at your bird's droppings and determine if the droppings are normal or if there may be a potential problem. And of course, the importance of a yearly well check or wellness visit with your veterinarian. The reason it's important to go over all these things is because when we bring birds into our home, we're ultimately responsible for their health. They rely on us to give them the proper food, to keep their environment clean, to stimulate them mentally and physically, and to keep them away from dangers. So if we're feeding the wrong food, or we're not keeping the cage clean enough, if we're exposing them to potential toxins or dangers in their environment, and if we're not allowing them to exercise and to keep their feathers clean by bathing, we are setting them up for problems and illnesses. The mainstay of keeping our birds healthy is to provide them good nutrition. And we're fortunate today in that we have a variety of very healthy pelleted options for our birds. Years ago, we would just feed our bird seed, sometimes even wild bird seed, because we didn't have the knowledge or the availability of the better diets. But nowadays we have very good diets available to feed our birds. And there's some shown here. The names of some of the pellets are written there. Tops, Harrison's, Rowdy Bush, those are all really good pellets. One thing I would recommend is that you avoid the artificially colored and flavored pellets. Some birds can have issues with those artificial colors and flavors, and so it's just best to avoid those if possible. And the pellets should make up somewhere around half to 2/3 of the bird's diet. And that's when we're talking about larger parrots. The exception to this rule would be if we are talking about smaller birds that are from more arid regions that don't have as much water in their environment and rely more on seeds as part of their natural diet as opposed to fruits and vegetables and things like that. So things like cockatiels, parakeets, they should have a 50-50 mixture of pellets and seed. The reason being is that the pellets have a fairly high protein content, and because these birds don't drink a lot of water, they don't flush the excess protein out as quickly as other birds do, and so they have a tendency to develop kidney problems if they're fed just a straight pelleted diet. So in these birds we recommend 50-50 pellets and seed. The other exception to this rule would be in the Eclectus parrot, who has a very different digestive tract from the rest of the parrot species, and they should have little to no pellets in their diet. They should have primarily grains and vegetables in their diet, and fruit as well. Speaking of fresh fruits and vegetables, that's the next part of a healthy diet for your birds. Birds can eat a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. All of them contain good nutrition, especially if you're feeding them fresh. The best nutritionally complete vegetables would be the dark green vegetables and the orange vegetables. So things like kale, collards, broccoli, sweet potatoes, carrots, things like that all have excellent nutrition for your birds. And it's good to offer them a wide variety because, as you know, different vegetables come in season at different times of the year. And so, if you expose your birds to a wide variety of foods when they're young, they are used to eating different things. And so as the vegetables become more available, they can easily consume those if you provide them for them. One thing I would recommend is that you do not feed avocado in any form to your bird. No guacamole or straight avocado slices or anything like that, because avocado is toxic to birds. Garlic and onion also can be toxic to animals, and so you want to try to avoid these as well. As I mentioned before, the fresh foods are best, and you can dice them, you can slice them, you can grate them, however you can get your bird to eat them. The important thing is to provide it in a way that's acceptable to your bird. And so there's no set way in the form that you provide it for your birds. If you don't have access to fresh foods at the moment, frozen foods are good. If the bird does not like raw, you can provide steamed vegetables or cooked vegetables. But remember, the more cooked the food is, the less nutrition is available from the food. Fruits are higher in sugar than vegetables are, and so we generally recommend that you limit the fruits. But birds can eat fruit. They can have apples, grapes, citrus, things like that. And then also, a lot of people will cook food for their birds. They'll make a mash from grains, and they'll chop up vegetables. They'll put a whole bunch of things in a food processor and mix it up, or they'll just chop it up manually. You can make a big batch of it and freeze it, and then just defrost a little bit every day for your bird. Parrot University regularly has classes on making chop, and I believe they even sell chop, so you always have that option available to you if you want to mix up the vegetables in one easy to administer supplement. In the wild, you'll be surprised to know that birds do not have food bowls sitting there with their daily nutrition in it. They have to search for their food. They often have to break things apart to get to their food. And so they spend a great deal of their time during the day looking for and eating food. So for us to put the food in a bowl and just leave it there for them is not really mentally stimulating for them. It's not good exercise for them, and it's not a natural way for them to eat. So one way that you can help with that is you can use foraging toys to provide food for them. And There's a variety of different ones that you can use, but basically the birds have to work a puzzle to get to the food, or they have to tear something apart to get to the food, and it's a more natural way for them to eat their food. Plus it keeps them busy and it keeps them mentally engaged, so you're less likely to have issues with screaming, feather picking, things like that. And it's good exercise for the bird as well. So besides foraging, there are some other ways that we can encourage exercise in our birds. It's really important to keep them moving and keep them busy, because in the wild they spend a great deal of their time moving, flying, things like that. And if we have them confined in a cage for the whole day, that really is not good for their cardiovascular system or for their mental health. Flying, of course, is the best exercise that a bird can have. It stimulates their cardiovascular system. It keeps their muscles in good shape. The effect of wind on their feathers releases endorphins, and so it keeps them mentally healthy as well. So if you can allow your birds to fly safely, that's the best exercise that you can get. And of course, I emphasize the word safely because you want to avoid hazards that we'll talk about later, like windows, mirrors, ceiling fans, other pets, things like that, because you don't want them getting injured by them flying around. You also don't want them to have access to potential toxins. And the more mobile they are flying, obviously, the more availability they have to those potential toxins. If your bird's wings are trimmed, or if you can't allow them to fly, you can still encourage them to exercise by flapping their wings. So you can hold them on your hand and kind of drop your hand and let the birds fly or flap. And that is good exercise as well. It exercises their pectoral muscles and gets their heart rate going up a little bit as well. Stair climbing, jumping up and down steps, can be good exercise for the birds and keeps them moving. Ropes, things like that, things that they can move around on their cage, or you can hang a net on the side of their cage or on the wall and have them climb up. And then also doing tricks with your bird, teaching them to fetch, teaching them to play basketball, teaching them to fly to you, jump to you, things like that. All those things keep them moving and keep their cardiovascular system in good health and their muscles as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about hygiene and keeping your bird's environment clean. As I mentioned earlier, they rely on us to keep their environment clean for them. They don't have Mother Nature washing things regularly and things like that. So we're responsible for making sure our bird's cage and environment is clean and healthy for them. So how can we do that? First of all, you want to change your bird's cage liner regularly, and I usually recommend that you keep newspaper at the bottom of the cage because it's easy to clean, and it's also easy to examine your bird's droppings as you're cleaning the cage. Some people use butcher paper or craft paper or something like that. All that is good, but you just want to avoid things like corn cob, walnut shells, things like that that can grow yeast and bacteria, and if the bird consumes them, can potentially be harmful to them. But it's important to change the papers regularly, and especially if there's no grate in the bottom of the cage, because you don't want the birds to have access to foods that have been dropped down to the bottom of the cage, or getting down into their droppings and that kind of thing, because that could be exposure for bacteria or yeast. Usually what I recommend is that you spray the paper with some water. You use a mist bottle and just spray the paper, because that will help to wet any feather debris down and wet some seed holes, that kind of thing, so that they don't scatter everywhere or fly everywhere as you're folding up the paper. If you're feeding fresh foods, which you should, you want to remove those after a few hours because they will begin to grow bacteria and yeast as well. And you want to clean the birds' bowls daily. Having fresh foods, especially in the bird's bowl, will cause accumulation of debris inside those bowls, and that's a good place for bacteria to grow. The water bowl or water bottle also needs to be cleaned on a regular basis. A lot of people think that if you give them a water bottle, you only have to clean it or refill it when it's empty, and that's not really the case. The water bottles are good because it keeps the birds from dumping food into their water bowl and contaminating the water. But the water bottles need to be cleaned regularly as well. I recommend that you clean the water bottles daily, especially the tip where the birds are potentially depositing food as they're drinking, and the little ball that is inside the tip. Just making sure those stay clean on a regular basis. And then you want to clean the grate in the cage, you want to clean the perches, you want to clean the toys on a regular basis because they will accumulate droppings and debris on them. Obviously, if you have birds, you know they produce a lot of feather dust, and there's feathers everywhere, and seed holes, and all that kind of things. Birds are not the cleanest of pets. So vacuuming becomes very important for birds. And also, a lot of people will have air purifiers in the bird's environment just to keep the feather dander down. One thing that's very important to do with your birds to monitor for potential issues is to weigh them on a regular basis. And you can train your bird to get on the scale or sit on a perch on the scale, and it's a very easy thing. And just keep a chart of your bird's weight. Because a lot of times if there's a weight change, and especially if it's a gradual change over time, we're not really aware of it. But if we have a chart and we can see what the bird weighs week after week after week, if we start seeing a change in that bird's weight, whether it be an increase or a decrease, that could be a sign of a problem. And so it's a good idea to always have a gram scale and to use that gram scale on a regular basis to weigh your birds. Showering or bathing for your bird is very important to keep their feathers in optimal condition. In the wild, of course, they have natural showers, or they have puddles that they can bathe in, that kind of thing. So we have to provide that kind of opportunity when we have the birds in our home. How we do that depends on the bird and depends on our home. It could be something like a spray bottle misting them if they tolerate that. You have to be careful with that because a lot of birds will view that as a negative thing and as a punishment. And so you just want to be really careful and make it a pleasant, positive experience for your bird rather than a negative. They can go in the shower with you. They make perches with suction cups on them that will adhere to the shower wall, and the bird can sit on there or sit on the shower rod, something like that while you're taking a shower. Some birds like to bathe in dishes. So for example, some of the ground birds, African grays, they like to bathe in a dish of water or in a puddle, something like that. So usually I recommend putting a Pyrex dish or something similar in the bottom of their cage and have an inch of water or something like that in there. And sometimes you can put some greens or some treats in the dish to entice them to go into it. But a lot of birds will go into it on their own. One trick that often works with birds is to run the vacuum when you provide them with a bathing opportunity, and for whatever reason the sound of the vacuum will actually stimulate the birds to bathe. Some birds like to be bathed outside in the warmer weather, so you can take them out in a small cage and shower them with the hose. Sometimes just being outdoors in the outdoor environment and sounds will stimulate the birds to bathe. So the important thing is to find out which method your bird prefers and just provide them that opportunity on a very regular basis. Many times our birds will require routine grooming as part of their care. Their nails can get overgrown, their beak can become too long, or in a lot of cases we see misshapen beaks or deformed beaks, and those need maintenance to keep them from developing worse problems. And so whether you do that at home as a trained behavior, such as filing your birds, teaching your bird to have its nails filed, holding its wing up so you can trim its wings, that kind of thing. Those can be trained behaviors. So you can do it that way, or you can have someone experienced with grooming do that for you, whether it be a groomer or veterinary office, whatever, to keep those wings, nails, and beak in good condition. The beak and the nails do have quicks in them, and so if you clip them too short, they will bleed. So if you do this at home, you want to make sure you have some kind of clotting substance available to stop the bleeding. And you have to be careful in the wings with blood feathers not to cut a new feather that's coming in, because it does have a blood supply to it. It's called a blood feather. And so you want to avoid those feathers when you're clipping the wings. Again, if you are uncomfortable with this or not sure about it, it's better to have an expert do that for you. Birds have a very sensitive respiratory system, very efficient respiratory system. They're able to extract very small amounts of oxygen from the air, which is extremely helpful to them when they're flying and need a lot of oxygen, and especially when they're at higher altitudes when there isn't as much oxygen in the environment. But that feature to their anatomy also can be a detriment to them as far as pollutants in the air. And so when we have the birds in our home, we have to be very careful about the things that they are potentially exposed to, because they can be very harmful to them. Things like cigarette smoke, scented candles, air fresheners, gas fireplaces, kerosene heaters, cleaning products. All those things could potentially cause respiratory issues in our bird. The big thing that most people are aware of, but definitely needs to be mentioned, is nonstick cookware. That can be toxic and fatal to our birds. When the Teflon or PTFE surface of the nonstick cookware gets overheated, it can release fumes that we cannot smell or do not affect us, but they can actually kill our bird in a matter of minutes. The pan does not have to burn, it just has to overheat. And so we do not recommend that you have any Teflon coated pans in your house at all. Luckily now we have some nonstick options that are safe. So there's some ceramic options that are safe, there's greenware, things like that that you can use safely in your birds. Just when you're looking for cookware for your house, make sure it says PTFE free. The other thing you have to remember is that new appliances can have a coating on them that when you first use them, they burn up this coating and release fumes, and you have to be very careful about that around your birds. So when you're using something for the first time, like an oven or a new appliance, iron, something like that, even when you have new carpeting or a new heating and air conditioning system, you want to air out the house after you run that. Keep the birds out of the house for example, when you get new carpeting, and leave the birds out until the new carpet odor goes away. With the heating and air conditioning, you want to run that and burn up any coatings that are on the coils and such with the bird out of the house, and again, air out the house before you bring the birds back in. So here's an example of Teflon coated pan that's toxic to your birds and that you want to avoid. again, because their respiratory tract is so sensitive, we just have to be super careful about things that we expose them to in the respiratory tract. So I mentioned about the new appliances and to run those without the bird present to get rid of any coatings that are on the new appliances. But with ovens, especially the ovens that have self-cleaning features on them, you want to definitely not use those with birds, because that can also release fumes that are deadly to birds. So do not use the self-cleaning oven feature. This is a list of things in your home that could potentially have a Teflon coating on them. So besides pots and pans, you're talking about things like irons, sandwich makers, George Foreman grill, waffle irons, curling irons, things like that. All these things can have a Teflon coating and potentially could be toxic to your birds. So you definitely want to try to avoid these things, avoid having these things in your home. If your bird is exposed to these things, for whatever reason, you want to get them to fresh air as soon as possible. So get them out of the house and try to get them in the purest air that you can to clear this out of their lungs. And then, of course, get them to your veterinarian as soon as possible. Ceiling fans present a great danger to birds in our homes, especially the flighted birds. We see a lot of injuries related to ceiling fans, and so we always recommend that if you have a bird out of its cage, that you have the ceiling fans turned off just for their safety. The injuries can range from anything from broken bones to bruising to concussions to fractured skulls to death. So very important not to run the ceiling fans when your birds are out. And of course, other pets in our household can be a great danger to our birds as well. Cat injuries, dog injuries are not uncommon with our pet birds. And a lot of times the injuries themselves, whether it be a scratch or a bite, something like that, are not that serious, but the infection that comes with these bites can be very deadly. The bacteria in a cat's mouth or on its claws is very, very harmful to birds and actually can kill a bird very quickly. And so even though the initial injury doesn't look that bad, you definitely want to get it cleaned up, and you definitely want to take the bird to the veterinarian to have them looked at and be put on antibiotics to avoid a deadly infection. These are some pretty graphic photos of some injuries by dogs on these birds. And it just highlights the importance of monitoring your pets when your birds are out, especially because a lot of dogs hunt animals as part of their natural behavior. And even though this bird is in your home and a pet, the dog doesn't necessarily equate that with hands off. So they still may go after the bird and try to play with the bird or pick it up in its mouth or paw it or something like that, and can cause severe harm to your bird. So always, always, always supervise your non-bird pets when your bird is out of its cage. These are some pictures of other potential hazards in your household, things like toxic plants. If the bird gets to the plants and eats them, that can potentially cause some issues. Stained glass has lead in the solder, so you have to be very careful about that in your home. Things that have water, hold water, can potentially cause drowning in birds, so open-topped aquariums, filled bathtubs, filled sinks, things like that. Mirrors, windows, we've already talked about ceiling fans, leather, tanned leather like from clothes or whatnot, has heavy metals in it as part of the tanning process, and so that is toxic to birds. They do make leather toys and leather that is tanned with the vegetable materials that are safe to use in birds, but things like belts and leather shoelaces and things like that are not safe to give to your bird. Zippers, especially with the cockatoos, are a big no-no because for some reason the cockatoos like to dismantle the zippers and then swallow them, and then they have these metal foreign bodies. A lot of jewelry will have lead or zinc in them. We've talked about the fumes from the fireplace, but also obviously the heat, burns and things like that from fireplaces. You have to be careful with that. And then sharp objects that the birds can land on or fly into and cut themselves also can be a hazard. So this is an example of one of the things that birds find irresistible. It's a little tea light, and the container that it's in has lead or zinc in it, and so the bird will consume that and get little pieces of that. And this at the very top is an x-ray of a bird, and you can see in its ventriculus, back by its back legs there, you can see the very white objects in its ventriculus, and that those are pieces of metal in there. Once the metal is inside the bird's digestive tract will start to dissolve that, and they will absorb those heavy metals, and then that can cause any variety of signs from GI issues to seizures to death. So definitely you want to avoid any exposure to these. Birds are very different from dogs and cats, and so you can't just apply things that you know from dogs and cats to birds, because they are not the same in many ways. Their anatomy is very different, their physiology is very different, and so it's important to know the differences between birds and other species. One example you can see here is their digestive tract. They have a dilation of their esophagus where their food goes down, and it's called the crop, and the crop stores food before it is released into the rest of the GI tract for digestion. From the crop, the food goes to the first stomach, which is the proventriculus, and that's similar to our stomach, where it uses acids to break down the foods. And then from there, the food moves into the gizzard, which is the second stomach, and that's a very muscular stomach, and it will grind up the food and break it down that way. The end product, the feces from the GI tract, actually combines with the waste from the urinary tract inside the cloaca of the bird, and so when the dropping comes out, it has both the waste from the GI tract and the urinary tract. Bird skeletons are also very different from dog and cat skeletons. Looking at the skull, you can see how large the eye socket is in birds, and depending on the species, the eye socket can be extremely large, like in owls, for example. The orbits are very large to accommodate the very big eyes. Going down from there, you see in the neck, the vertebrae, when the bird is in a resting position, the vertebrae are in an S-shaped or a curve shape. And that's important to know, because when we restrain the birds, we want to stretch out the neck so that those vertebrae are straight, like our neck vertebrae are. The reason for this is if we leave them in a curved position like that, the bird has a great deal of mobility in its neck, and it can easily turn or move its head to bite us and draw blood. So straightening out those vertebrae definitely is advised. If you look on the body of the bird right at the front, there's a very large flat structure that's called the keel, and that's where the pectoral muscles attach, and those are the muscles that are used for flying. They're the biggest muscles in the bird, and so they need a really large place, secure place to attach to for the strength, and so that's the function of the keel. Other bones, which you're not able to see in the skeleton, keratin, but other bones in the bird are hollow to allow them to be lighter and to be able to fly. The reason this becomes important is that because most dog and cat vets do not have knowledge of birds' unique anatomy and physiology and are not comfortable dealing with their unique qualities. And so when you're looking for an avian vet, you want to make sure you find someone who does have that knowledge and that experience. That requires generally more training than a basic vet school education will provide. Usually people that are working on birds have done extensive training outside of the normal veterinary education in order to learn how to properly take care of these birds. One place that you can look for recommendations for an avian vet is the website aav.org. That's the Association of Avian Veterinarians. And certainly that's a good place to start to see if there is someone in your area that is comfortable dealing with birds. An important thing to know is that birds get sick or appear to get sick very quickly, and sometimes you need a vet in an emergency situation. And when you are dealing with an emergency, that's not the time to be looking for an avian vet. You want to have a relationship established already with an avian vet. So, bring them in for wellness visits so that the vet is familiar with you, familiar with your bird, its environment. Maybe you even have some baseline lab work done on your bird already. So should it ever get sick, then the vet has something to compare back to. So making sure to establish that relationship with your vet early can really help things out when you have an illness or an emergency situation. Birds are prey species. That means that in the wild, they are eaten by other things. And so their natural instinct is to hide their illness as long as possible, because predators will seek out sick or injured prey because it's easier for them to catch. And so the birds try to hide their illness for as long as they possibly can, which is a survival skill. But that also means when they actually show signs that they're sick, when they're fluffed or sitting in the bottom of the cage or have stopped eating, that means they're very, very sick, that they have no more reserves left where they can hide their illness. And so it's important for us to recognize signs of illness early in our birds. Change in their appetite, change in their weight, as we discussed earlier, change in their preening habits, change in their vocalization, change in their droppings. All these things can be subtle changes that can tell us that the bird may be getting sick before it gets to the point of being on the bottom of the cage. Bringing your bird for wellness visits is very important for maintaining its health. You'd be surprised at how many times we pick up on illnesses in birds during a routine quote-unquote well visit. Because again, the birds are masters at hiding their illness, and the owners may not know or not be aware of the subtle signs that the bird is showing. One thing that your veterinarian can do to help identify your bird is to implant a microchip, and that's done in the pectoral muscles, again, the big muscles that they use for flying. And the microchip is very small. It's about the size of a grain of rice. So depending on the bird, it may need to be put under anesthesia. A very large bird like a macaw, there's no issues with that generally. It's just a needle stick. But if you're talking about a small bird like a cockatiel or something like that, it may be better to have them under anesthesia or sedated to have the microchip implanted. The microchip is a way to individually be able to trace the bird back to you. So you register the microchip with all your contact information. Should the bird get lost, fly away, or even be stolen, the bird can be traced back to you through the microchip number. So it's a good way to identify birds. Bands do have some identifying information on them if you know the bird's band number. There are traceable bands and non-traceable bands. The majority of bands that we see on birds are non-traceable. So if your bird were to get out, the person that finds the bird would not be able to track you down through the band number in most cases. Bands also, oftentimes I see bands that are too big or potentially too small for the birds. Especially if they're too big, they can get hung up on toys in the cage, hung up on, we've seen several of them that have been caught behind the food or the water bowls, and that can lead to broken legs, self-mutilation, trying to free the leg, things like that. And so usually if the bands are too big, I will recommend removing those. And again, they're not a permanent traceable way to identify your bird. So the microchip is the best way to do that. We have one commercially available vaccination for birds. It's for a virus called polyoma, which causes severe disease and death primarily in young birds. And it can be a real devastating problem in nurseries that are hand feeding a lot of birds. So we do have that vaccination available. Usually if a bird is not exposed to a lot of birds as it gets older, its risk of contracting polyoma or showing severe signs of it are pretty slim. In adult birds, if they contract the disease, a lot of times they'll just show signs of like a flu-like symptoms where they'll be quiet for a few days. They may not eat very well for a few days, but in general they can get over it on their own. The exception to that is the Eclectus parrot, which seems to be particularly sensitive to polyomavirus. So even as adults, they can be very sick and die from polyoma. Training your bird is a great way to keep it engaged mentally, and depending on what you're training can also be good exercise for the bird. It also helps to establish a better bonding or relationship between you and your bird. In addition to all those things, you can train some very useful behaviors that may come in handy should you need them if a bird gets sick or injured. One of those things is syringe training your bird. So you can teach your bird to take liquids from a syringe, and so that way when your bird gets sick, if you need to give them any kind of medication through the syringe, your bird is already trained to do that. So you don't have to catch the bird up in order to give its medicine. It should just be able to take it from the syringe. And ParrotU offers a lot of training classes to be able to do that. But basically you start with target training. You get the bird to touch a target with its mouth, and then you make the target the syringe, and then you put liquid in the syringe. And so these are all just slow steps and kind of going through it very, very briefly, but the training classes will go into much more detail with it. And then usually you put something sweet in there that the bird will like, some kind of cherry juice or natural grape juice, something like that. And so the liquid becomes the reward for the behavior. And you can train a bird even in as little as 15 or 20 minutes to take liquids from a syringe. Another behavior that's very, very useful to train is towel training. So again, if you have an emergency at home and you need to towel your bird for whatever reason, your bird is already used to being in the towel, and that won't cause added stress. Another great reason to towel train your bird is for their veterinary visits. If your bird is already trained to be in a towel, that really decreases the stress at the veterinary visits and makes it easier for us to restrain the bird and capture the bird for its exam. And that's another behavior that can be trained at home. As I've already stated, the bird's droppings contain the waste products from the urinary tract and from the GI tract. And changes in the droppings can be an early sign of illness. So you always want to be paying attention to your bird's droppings. So here is a picture of the normal components in a bird's droppings. So the feces are the tubular, kind of wormy-like structure in the droppings. The urine is more of a clear liquid that surrounds the droppings, and depending on the species, there may be more or less urine. So that, again, depends on how much water the bird drinks or how much fluid the bird takes in general. So for your desert birds, the droppings tend to be more dry than in some of the rainforest birds, for example. The urinary tract actually has two components to it as far as waste products go, and the urine is one of those. The other waste product from the urinary tract is called urates, and urates are left over from the reptilian ancestry of the birds. So in reptiles, their byproduct of the urinary tract is urates. It's a solid, dense form of waste product rather than the more liquid urine. So birds actually have a mammalian component to their kidneys and also a reptilian component to their kidneys. And so they have both waste products from the kidneys, and those were present in the droppings. The picture on the bottom shows an example of a lot of urine around the dropping. A lot of people confuse an excess of urine with diarrhea. So diarrhea is actually a loosening of the feces, where the feces become more liquidy. So instead of seeing the worm in the dropping, the wormy feces, you will see more of a puddle for the fecal component. That is true diarrhea. Much more commonly in birds, you will see an excess of urine in birds, and that's called polyuria. So the droppings are very, very wet, but the fecal portion is still solid and looks like a worm. So those things are caused by different, the polyuria and the diarrhea are caused by different things, and so it's important to know the difference between them. So what can you tell by looking at your bird's droppings? You can tell a lot of things. As I mentioned earlier, if the droppings are very small and dark, the fecal portion is very black, or maybe there's no fecal portion at all, that means that the bird is not eating well or not eating at all. Diarrhea, again, is if the fecal portion is liquidy. You also can see blood in the droppings, and the blood can be intermixed in the feces. It could be from the urinary tract. It could be just little flecks of dry blood, but it's important to notice if there's any blood in the droppings. Changing color of the fecal portion or of the urates could be a sign of illness. So, for example, sometimes in liver disease, we'll see that the fecal component of the dropping becomes almost like a lime green color, and the urates can become either green or very yellow instead of being a creamy white color. So changing color can be a sign of problems. Just be aware that certain foods will also cause a change in color of the droppings. So for example, if you feed blackberries, then the droppings will come out more red, so don't confuse that with blood. And then increased urine, increased liquid around the droppings also should be something that you take note of. So here we have some photos of some abnormal droppings. So in the top picture, you'll see that there's a lot of urine in this dropping, but also the fecal portion looks very irregular. It looks like there's some undigested seed in there, and it doesn't have the typical worm shape that the fecal portion of the dropping should have. On the upper right is we're seeing the green urates or urine, and then the fecal portion is very dark. So this looks like a bird that probably isn't eating well and maybe has some liver disease going on as well. The lower left looks like a case of diarrhea. There's no formed feces in that bird's droppings. And then on the bottom right, the droppings there's a lot of urates in these droppings, and the droppings are very dry. So all these things are abnormal and something that you should take note of as you're cleaning the bottom of the bird's cage each day. Here's some more abnormal droppings. We can see a lot of different coloration in the droppings. On the bottom right, you have the green, and the upper left, on the left, you have the yellow urates, and then in the top right, you have the dark, looks like maybe digested blood in the droppings there. These are all abnormal, and they are all cause for concern and should be examined by a veterinarian. All bird owners should have a first aid kit for their bird, and the first aid kit should be reserved exclusively for the bird and be in an area where the bird spends a lot of time, so you have easy access to it should you need it. And here's a list of some things that should be in the first aid kit. So things like a towel for restraint, bandaging materials, cornstarch for stopping any bleeding, wounds, or injuries, pliers or tweezers for dealing with blood feathers if you are comfortable doing that. A flashlight or a pen light is really useful for seeing below the feathers or seeing areas that are hard to see without additional light. Then you need some sort of disinfectant, a heat source to keep them warm when they get sick, some kind of electrolyte solution to use when they're not feeling well in place of water, or you can syringe feed it, the syringe to give the medication with, and then something to clean out wounds with, like saline or something along those lines. As I mentioned earlier, birds are a prey species, and so if they show signs that they're sick, they're very, very ill. So you don't want to wait and see how things go with them if they're showing severe signs of illness. You want to get them seen as soon as possible. And obviously with emergencies, any kind of injuries or exposure to toxins or something like that, you want them seen as soon as possible to give them the best chance that they can to survive the emergency. One thing that you may encounter with your bird that constitutes an emergency is bleeding. Birds can break blood feathers, and they can bleed significantly from that. In the middle picture there is a picture of a blood feather. Again, that's a new feather that's growing in, usually in the wing or the tail, and the blue in the shaft of that feather is actually blood. And once the feather finishes growing in, that blood supply goes away. But while it's growing in, there is blood there, and if that feather were to break, it can bleed just like if they cut themselves. The picture on the right is a picture of a bird with a broken blood feather and the blood associated with it. But in addition to that, they can also have significant bleeding from wounds, dog and cat wounds, ceiling fan injuries, etc., etc. So any kind of significant bleeding is cause for concern and for an emergency visit. Some of our female birds are egg layers, and we definitely do not want to encourage that in the females because it can lead to a lot of potential problems. One of those problems is what we call egg binding, where the bird is not able to pass the egg and the egg gets stuck. That's more common in overweight birds, unconditioned birds, birds that haven't had a lot of exercise, or sometimes there's a problem with the egg itself, where maybe the bird hasn't had enough calcium and the egg is deformed or soft-shelled or something like that, and presents some problems there. So the signs of egg binding are sitting in the bottom generally, straining. A lot of times you can hear a grunting sound. You can see some swelling in the vent area. And as time goes on, the bird just gets weaker and weaker because it's not able to pass the eggs. The x-ray on the left shows a bird that has 2 calcified eggs in its body. Normally there should only be 1 calcified egg in the body. Most of our parrot species lay eggs every other day, and it takes 24 hours for the shell to be put on the egg as it's developing. And so you should not have more than one egg with a shell in the body at one time. So the fact that there are two showing up in this x-ray means that there is definitely an issue with the bird laying the eggs. Another problem often due to egg laying, but sometimes we also see in cockatoos that have OCD and like to try to pass droppings on command or something like that, they can actually prolapse the cloaca. So the internal lining inside their vent can actually come to the outside. And obviously that's not meant to be there, and so it can dry out, it can get infected and cause severe illness. So if the birds have any of these egg-laying issues or prolapses, they need to be seen as soon as possible. As I mentioned earlier, birds are very efficient breathers. So if you see a bird that's having trouble breathing, if it is open mouth breathing, if it's really putting a lot of effort into each breath, and in the long-tail species, if you see their tail bobbing with each breath, that means something seriously is going on with this bird's respiratory tract. And that bird needs to be seen as soon as possible. The other important thing to know with this is that you want to decrease the stress as much as possible on this bird, because it's trying as hard as it can to breathe, and you don't want to do anything to make it more stressed under these conditions. Birds have a very, very high metabolism, and so if they stop eating, they can lose weight and they can die in just a few days. So again, like a dog or a cat, if they're not eating for a day, you may decide to wait to see the veterinarian. But if a bird stops eating, it needs to be seen as soon as possible. And one way that you can tell if it's eating or drinking is to look at its droppings. If the bird is not eating, the droppings, the stool portion of the droppings will get very, very small and dark, like almost black in color. And so you can see a dramatic change from what it would normally look like when they are not eating. If they're not drinking, then you will see that the droppings are very dry. You'll see very little urine or urates coming out in the droppings. So if you see that your bird is not eating or drinking, that's an emergency situation. As I mentioned earlier, we do not want to wait until the bird is at the bottom of the cage before we recognize that the bird is sick, because that means that it's not able to hide its illness any longer. So obviously, if you see a bird that is showing any of these signs, fluffed, not vocalizing, not really responding to our presence, sitting on the bottom of the cage, sleeping, whatever, that's a very, very ill bird and needs to be seen ASAP. These are some other things that constitute emergencies in birds. If they have any kind of head trauma, flying into a wall, into a window, ceiling fan, things like that. Metal exposure, where you know that they have consumed whatever it happens to be, that needs to be seen before they start showing signs of any issues. Seizures can be caused from a number of different things, including heavy metal exposure or head trauma, but there's a number of other things that can cause that, and those need to be addressed as soon as possible. We talked about the bites and the scratches earlier, and things like feather loss also can be an emergency situation if it happens suddenly. So for example, sometimes they can start mutilating themselves or pulling out feathers because of some illness or because of a parasite or something like that. And it can actually, if they start mutilating themselves, they can actually bleed to death from their mutilation. So especially in the case of mutilation, we want to see that as quickly as possible. The bird here in the photograph is showing imbalanced head tilt problem and also red in the droppings, so likely that bird is toxic from heavy metal exposure. Okay, so you have an ill bird that you've noticed the early signs of illness in, hopefully, or you have an emergency situation, you've got your appointment with your veterinarian who you already have a relationship with. Now what do you do to get your bird there? So you want to bring the bird in its cage if possible. If it's a small bird and you're able to bring it in the cage, that way it's less stressful to the bird and you don't have to handle it to get it into another carrier. And you want to cover that cage when you're bringing it to the vet, because you don't want to stress the bird by it seeing all the things going by the car at 60 miles an hour. If you're not able to bring the cage with you, at least take the paper from the bottom of the cage and bring it to the veterinarian, so that we can look at the droppings and try to get an idea of what's going on with the bird. Depending on the weather conditions, you want to either make the car cool or warm to avoid any stress with temperature changes in your bird. And if you have given any meds to your birds, you want to bring those with you to show the veterinarians so they know what medications the bird has on board and how that may affect some of the testing that they do. While you're waiting for your vet appointment, before you take them to the vet, you want to keep your bird warm and quiet. Again, decreasing the stress as much as possible. You want the cage temperature to be somewhere around 80 degrees, and you can accomplish that with either a heating pad or a reptile heat bulb, something along those lines, to bring their environmental temperature closer to their body temperature to minimize any stress and minimize the energy that they have to use to maintain their body heat. If they are not able to perch, you want to make sure they have easy access to food and water, so moving the food and water down to the bottom of the cage where they can reach it if they want to. And again, if you have a bird in a larger cage, move it into a smaller cage, both for transport and also because in a smaller cage it's easier to maintain a warmer environment. So before you even go to the vet, you can put it in a smaller cage to keep it warm until your appointment. Birds are like potato chips. You can't just have one. So a lot of times we'll see if bird owners have a bird somewhere down the road, they will acquire another one or another two. The important thing when you do acquire new birds is that you don't want to risk the health of the bird that you already have. And so we recommend that you quarantine any new birds from existing birds for a period of at least 30 days, in the larger species even up to 45 days. The reason for that goes back to the birds being masters at hiding their illness. And so we want to make sure that the new bird is not bringing in something that's going to infect your other bird or even your family members. So keep them quarantined, and that'll give you time to have the bird checked out by your veterinarian, have tests run to make sure that there isn't any disease present, and also just being in a new home, new environment, that's stressful for the bird, and so a lot of times the bird will break with an illness if it is carrying it as it comes in. So you always want to take care of the quarantine birds last. If you're handling the birds, you want to wash up or change your clothes before you play with the bird that you already have in your home. A lot of people get very attached to their birds and they like to show signs of affection to their birds. One sign of affection that can be harmful to your bird on multiple levels is kissing your bird on the beak. And one of the ways this can be harmful is through transfer of bacteria. The bacteria in our mouth is not the same bacteria that birds have in their system, and it's actually very harmful to birds. And so if you're kissing them on the mouth, you're potentially transferring that bacteria to their mouth, to them, and making them sick. Also, certain illnesses that we have, for example, certain colds or bacterial sinus infections, can be contagious to birds as well. And so especially when you're sick, you don't want to put your face anywhere near their face, just to avoid the spread of disease that way. Also remember that in the wild, the only bird that's going to be feeding another bird is either a parent feeding a chick, or in an adult bird, it would be the mate. And so if you're feeding, particularly if you're feeding your bird something from your mouth, that is something reserved only for a mate. And so you are potentially confusing the bird and ramping up its hormones and potentially bringing on unwanted behaviors like screaming, feather picking, aggression, egg laying, etc., masturbating, by that act of feeding the birds from your mouth. So we strongly discourage you from doing that. And of course, then there's the obvious thing about potential trauma to your lip, especially with the larger birds. So just avoid kissing your bird on the mouth for multiple reasons. As I mentioned, new birds can be a source of infection, not only for the existing birds in your house, but also for your family members. And diseases that birds can carry that are contagious to humans are called zoonotic diseases. And the most common one of these that we see is psittacosis or chlamydiosis, parrot fever. They're all names for the same disease caused by an organism called Chlamydia psittaci. And that is spread in the secretions of animals, so either through their respiratory tract or through their droppings. And so you always want to be careful with a new bird in quarantine before you have had a chance to check it out. You want to make sure that you are keeping that cage clean, that you're washing up really well after you take care of that bird and clean that bird. Sometimes people will wear masks when they're changing the paper, just to avoid any potential infections there. With some of these zoonotic diseases like psittacosis, remember the very old, the very young, and the immunocompromised, for example, chemo patients, AIDS patients, things like that, are at most risk for that. So if you have any people in your household matching those descriptions, it might be better to have somebody else caring for the birds in quarantine just to avoid any potential exposure. A lot of people ask whether birds can get COVID. And as far as we are aware at this point, birds are not susceptible to COVID. They obviously are susceptible to other coronaviruses, as we've seen in the past, but not to the COVID situation that we're dealing with right now. Should your bird pass away, you can gain some very valuable information by doing a necropsy, which is an autopsy on a bird or an animal. And there are multiple reasons to do this. One is if you have other birds, or if you anticipate getting another bird, you want to know what happened to the bird that died. You want to make sure it's nothing contagious or something maybe that you had wrong in your husbandry that needs to be corrected with your other birds or before you get a new bird. So that could be a good reason to do a necropsy. Sometimes it's helpful to know, we're seeing these birds showing the signs. We tried this treatment and the bird still ended up dying. Was there something else going on? And it can help your veterinarian to learn, how to maybe do things differently the next time, to maybe save some birds down the road, and also just to get some increased education, because there's so much that's still not known about birds, and the knowledge base is just growing every year. And this is just another way to help educate the veterinarians to better treat the birds down the road. If your bird dies at home, and you want to have a necropsy done, you want to have it done as soon as possible, because their metabolism is very high and their tissues break down very quickly after they die. And so what you want to do is wet the bird down and get it cooled down as soon as possible to prevent the deterioration of the tissues. So wet it down thoroughly, try to get the feathers completely soaked, and then wrap it in a paper towel or something in a baggie, and then put it in the refrigerator. You don't want to freeze the bird, because when you freeze the bird, it destroys the tissues, so that microscopically there's not any work that can be done to get a diagnosis on that. So in order to be able to run tests and look at samples microscopically, the tissues cannot be frozen. So the refrigeration is best. And then again, getting it to the veterinarian as quickly as possible. So we've gone over a lot of information in a pretty short period of time, but hopefully you've gained some insight into things that you did not know before. We've gone over all the potential hazards in your home, so make sure to go through your home and kind of keep some of these things in mind, and maybe make some changes to improve the environment of your birds to keep them safer. We also talked about potential signs of illness and watching for those signs of illness to determine early on if the bird is getting sick, so that we can more successfully treat it. Checking your bird's droppings, how important that is, and what changes in the bird's droppings can potentially mean, is really very, very crucial to keeping your bird healthy. Keeping the bird's environment clean, keeping their food clean, providing them with a really nutritious diet and a variety of diets, and exercise and foraging, all these things that we talked about earlier, to keep them mentally and physically healthy. And then, of course, the yearly wellness exam, including lab work, to determine if there's something going wrong early, and then we can fix it a lot more easily. These are some other classes that are offered at Parrot U. Parrot 101 goes over the basics of bird care with you. Then there's a Fun with Food workshop, where you can learn to provide nutritious meals for your birds, including making chop that we talked about earlier. There are behavior and training classes, where you can learn to interact with your bird to get them to perform various behaviors, both for fun and also, as we mentioned, potentially for medical reasons, should you need them. Toy making. Instead of having to buy all your toys, you can learn how to make toys on your own, which is a good way to personalize toys for your bird, and also to recycle some materials that are in your home that can be great fun for your birds to play with. And then if you have problems with your bird, there's a class on problem solving and the things that you can do to correct those potential behavior problems that you have with your birds. Companion Parrots Rehomed is always looking for volunteers. The volunteers are so helpful in a variety of ways to the success of the organization. So if you have any desire to help, CPR would be more than happy to accept your help. You can work in the store, you can work at events with them, you can help them by making toys for the birds in the store or in foster, you can help raise funds, you can help promote the organization and the birds. So any way that you feel like you can be helpful, please contact them and let them know, and they'll be glad to steer you in the right direction. And of course, if you're not able to volunteer for whatever reason, you can still support CPR through financial donations or through physical donations for things on their wish list. The birds at the store are always in need of toys and food and things like that, and any donation you can make in that aspect is greatly appreciated.
To receive credit for avian health and wellness, please screenshot this slide and email it to education@companionparrots.org.